Greetings YouTubers and welcome to what will be a brief rundown, intro, tutorial, whatever you want to call it, on the John Tiller games, more specifically the Panzer Campaign games. For those who are unaware, the John Tiller series is a game series of really old school hex and counter turn-based operational campaign games, and they are extremely good. They are probably the best simulations of operational warfare you'll find anywhere these days. But there is a lot of stuff going on under the hood, and there is admittedly a bit of a learning curve, which I will hopefully alleviate somewhat. Now, the plan this far is a three-part series. Part one will be what you're looking at right now, which will be the intro and a brief run through, excuse me, of the optional rules. Part two will be on some movement tips, shortcuts, general quality of life stuff, and what to look out for in the user interface. And part three will be what is probably the least understood aspect of these games, which is supply and command and control. So without further ado, we are going to start with, if I can find my cursor, there we are. We are going to start with what is probably the most boring set, which is the optional rules, but they are fairly powerful, and the game balance can change pretty dramatically. Now, there are four of them that are insanely important, which is these four. So, naturally, I'm going to save them for last. The first two, manual defensive fire and automatic defensive fire, it simply introduces phase play, which means that in normal circumstances you move and fire in the same turn. Phase play means you move first, then there's a opponent defensive fire, and your own offensive fire followed by assault phase. Phase play is probably a good idea for something like Black Powder games, Napoleon campaigns, and Seven Year War. But in all the years that I've played Panzer campaigns, I have never ever met anybody who plays phase play with the Panzer campaign games. So let's just leave it out. Artillery setup simply means that after you've towed artillery can only move in travel modes, and then after you exit travel mode, there will be a percentage chance of each turn after that, at which point the artillery will be ready to fire. I usually play with it on for Panzer campaigns. For something like modern campaigns, I usually play with it off, simply because with all the automation and computers and so on and so forth in modern available for modern artillery units, it makes a little less sense. There is a slight balance shift. It mainly hurts the offensive player simply because he has a tendency to move his artillery a fair bit more. But it's not a huge effect. Recon spotting. Oh, and by the way, all these check marks, these are the rules that I normally play with. These four are non-negotiable in my case, but we'll get to that. Anyway, recon spotting. It enables the designated recon units to spend a third of their movement points to spot any possible concealed units within their range of vision. And actually, there's just been an update to that rule in Shield 44. I can't remember if it's made it into Mios yet. But basically, recon spotting now is visible range plus 1 hex, which means that your recon units are likely to survive a little bit longer. Not much longer, but a little bit. Virtual supply trucks. Without it, all your supply is determined by the global supply values. Hang on, I gotta kill my cat. Right, one cat killed. Now, where were we? Right, virtual supply shocks. Normally, all supply calculations are based on the universal global supply values. With virtual supply shocks, you introduce supply sources with a given value, and any particular in a specific hex will have a local supply value based on the distance and the terrain between that hex and the supply source. So what it does, it makes the road network much more important for supplies, so for supply issues. The more detailed version is explicit supply, which introduces uh, specific supply units, which we can then follow your troops around and resupply them. Personally, I don't play with explicit supply simply because there is already a minor shit ton of counters to move around, and adding even more to the clutter simply isn't necessary. So virtual supply shocks is the happy medium between the global supply and specific supply units. Optional surrender simply means that if a unit is assaulted, a unit that is broken, which is then subsequently assaulted and has nowhere to retreat, will instead be eliminated. Normally, I don't play with it on simply because I don't find much use for it. I mean, a broken surrounded unit that is assaulted will already be down to what, platoon size or something like that. So it might be a small advantage to the attacker, but mainly this is personal preference. Low visibility air effects is pretty much what it says on the can. If you have low visibility in the weather file, your air attack will be subsequently less effective. Quality fatigue modifier. Uh, this one I'm a little iffy about, to be honest. It's not that I don't get it or don't or can't see the reason behind it. I just think that high quality units already have so many advantages that introducing a modifier to the fatigue accumulation makes them almost superhuman. I've got to switch on this time because I forgot to switch it off. But again, it's not a huge deal breaker. It might be if you have a vast majority of high quality units on one side. Say, for example, the Smolensk games where you have A and B quality on the German side, and C and D on the Russian side. Simply because what it does, it introduces a modifier based on the quality of the unit. So A morale has, I think it's 50% of the normal morale accumulation. B is 2/3, and D is 1.2, something like that. It's basically the worse the quality, the more fatigue it gains. But again, personally, I don't like it simply because high quality units are extremely powerful already. So up to you, personal preference. Optional fire and optional assault is simply a average of, instead of having one die roll for the combat, it takes two and averages them out. It simply eliminates some of the more wild swings. I usually play with them often because I rarely see any particularly wild swings. But again, if you prefer a more predictable game, switch them on. If not, have them off. Doesn't really matter. Locking zones of control is again exactly what it says on the tin. All zones of control will lock. You cannot move between them. Never mind if you're a commando or if you move into an already friendly occupied hex. This one is fairly powerful, especially for highly fluid situations like Smolensk or France 40, simply because you can pretty easily surround and then subsequently eliminate units. I don't like it. I think there should be at least a chance to pull out, especially if you've already got a friendly unit adjacent. Higher fatigue recovery is, well, it introduces a more fast-paced game simply because normally you have to pull your troops out of combat for a day, maybe two, once they've gotten fatigued enough. High fatigue recovery simply means they can get back into the fight faster. It's not really an advantage to neither the attacker nor the defender simply because it affects both sides equally. So if you prefer a more fast-paced game, switch it on indirect fire and strikes by the map. This introduces this simply means you can use indirect fire and airstrikes to any hex you can see. Never mind if there's a visible enemy unit in it. Personally, I don't particularly like it. I mean, granted, the fire will only be at 1/4 of the effect, but it does mean that if you have an obvious enemy position, you can simply stand at a distance and shell him into pieces. I prefer to call down fires on targets I can actually see. Counter battery fire is there's a chance there's a parameter in the parameter file which gives a counter battery gives a chance for counter battery fire. Normally with Panzer campaigns I have it off simply because counter battery fire wasn't all that evolved. I mean it did exist in World War II, but it wasn't a specific doctrine. I usually play with it on in modern campaigns simply because with all the artillery radars and what else has modern campaigns has but it's fairly more common. Night fatigue should definitely be on. Basically, what it does is if you move during a night turn, you will gain fatigue. Now there has been some improvements in the past few patches with night disruption and so on, which gives fairly strict limits to what you can and cannot do on night turns without risking disruption. But still, if playing without night fatigue means you can simply just push your troops constantly 24/7, which is by no means realistic. No low fuel effects should normally be off. It might be an option to switch it on in very short scenarios, simply because in the short scenarios you have very strict timelines, and if some of your armored units accidentally drop out because of low fuel, it might affect the balance. But in anything larger, say 10 turns plus thereabouts, it should be on. Otherwise, the whole basis for the supply system starts to fall apart. Broken weather is, you might as well call it historical weather. This simply, if you're playing with broken weather, you will always know what the weather is during the campaign at each specific day. With the Dwarf, there's an entry in the parameter file that gives you percentage changes of what the weather will be during that day. Normally, I play with the Dawn simply because I'm lazy, to be honest. Limited air recon. It simply means that if you use air recon units and they spot enemy units with limited recon switched on, you cannot attack these units with neither artillery nor air combat units. Normally, I play with it on. So the turn limits us. The turns are 2 hours. So if having a recon flight pass over and then get back to base and report back to another artillery battery, it's not really realistic. And besides, if you've ever played the Normandy game, you will definitely want this on. Otherwise, you will get absolutely pulverized by the Allied air attacks. Delayed disruption reporting is simply if you inflict a disruption result on an enemy unit, you won't know about it until the next turn. Whether you want to play with it on or off mainly depends on how familiar you are with the game system. If you can sort of predict when when and where the enemy might have been disrupted. It's usually a benefit for the defender, simply because the attacker can't be exactly sure whether or not it's disrupted, and thus can't predict if the odds are optimal for an assault. Although the same can also be said for the attacker. The defensive artillery cannot say for certain whether a possible attacker has been disrupted and thus be unable to assault, or if you need to fire on them all. So don't use it unless you're very familiar with the games. Normally I play with the DOF again because I'm lazy. I like to have I'm a bit of an information junkie. I like to have them the results on screen as they happen. Which brings us to the most important 4 optional rules. Let me just get all this coloring out of the way. Now, alternate, indirect airstrike, and direct fire. These. Come on, give me a break. The first 3, they are all lumped into one category. Basically, what it does is if you fire against us, if you have soft fire against a target that is anything but anti-tank, the effect will be spread over all the units in the hex. So it suddenly becomes a very, very bad idea to have doom stacks, simply because any attack against one of them will attack all of them, which means that all the targets will gain fatigue. And it also means that you cannot single out a particular enemy units. Now, take Mios, for example, which is the game we're seeing here in the background. If you have these alternate direct fire off, all the Russian actually has to do is target any and all German AT guns, and once they're out of the picture, his armor can just run roughshod over anything. So it's at least in my opinion, it's a bit more historical. I mean, if you had a hex with an infantry battalion and a company of AT guns, the AT guns will be spread out along the firing line and will be just as vulnerable or as the infantry. The AT guns are unlikely to be sighted on a hill with a 6-foot neon sign saying "Shoot me, please." So I always play with these on, always. And the one I always play with off is this one, alternative assault resolution. I get the idea behind it. I think the theory is sound, but there are some major problems with it. What it does is any assault that attacks a hard target will use the hard attack value, which the idea was that infantry units, which usually has fairly low hard attack value simply because the handheld AT weapons weren't specifically effective, nor for that matter prolific, they shouldn't be able to assault armored targets, which is sorta, kinda true. The problem is that, first of all, it gives far too much emphasis on armor, at least in my opinion. I mean, you can have a single unit of Stooks just holding a line against an entire battalion of infantry trying to assault it because they can't hurt it. And the second and most important thing here is the John Tiller system doesn't differentiate between armor and fortifications. It's hard targets and soft targets, which means that if you have infantry in a bunker, they suddenly become a hard target. So normal tactical advice to take infantry out of a bunker would be artillery and assault engineers with flamethrowers and demolition charges and that stuff. That won't work with this rule switch on because it's a hard target. Your best bet is actually, weirdly enough, anti-tank guns or unsupported armor, simply because they're the ones that have the highest heart attacks, and thus they are more likely to inflict damage on fortified targets. It leads to, at least in my opinion, widely ahistorical play, and I absolutely refuse to play with this one on. And if you ever tried playing something like Normandy or the Sea Lion game or the Japan games, anything with a seaborne invasion against bunkers, you will very quickly learn that without this one switched off, it is almost impossible to get off these beaches. And with that, we get to the end of part 1. And I will try to see if I can make this a little more interesting in parts 2 and 3. But these optional rules are kind of important, especially the alternative ones, the resolution here that I've talked about. So just to make sure we are all on the same page and all playing with the same rules, we had to go through this. See you in part 2.